I'm just going to formally welcome everybody to today. This is actually probably a record-breaking session. We have more people signed up for the event today than we have had before. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you to this. This is part of the Futures of Design Education series. That's organised by the education group of the Design Research Society. I'll post a link to what it is that we do, and if you want to join the DRS or the education special interest group, feel free to follow that link. I'll also post a link to where we actually keep in contact in social media platform now. We've now moved to the Mighty platform, so we'll put a link to that if you want to keep up to date with what's happening. So this is really the discussion series that pluralizes or attempts to pluralize design education. And that's still largely our goal with what we do with this discussion. So I'm really, really delighted today that we have two key speakers in this particular area. The rest of the Futures talks, we're probably going to take a break over the summer. So we might not have a talk in June and July. We might do something in August. We're not entirely too sure, but we'll be back in September definitely. And we'll post any future events on Eventbrite. We'll also let you all know what the next sort of series is going to be and the speakers that we have there. As always, we are always keen for suggestions on future speakers. So if anybody is aware of any design educators that are working in different spaces, whose voices you'd like to hear, then let us know and we'll try to get them, give them a platform and hear what they have to say. So there we go. Today I'm really delighted to welcome back Fred van Amstel. Actually, Fred was one of our first speakers, believe it or not. That was quite a while ago actually. And Hien Fan, who has been working with Fred. Yeah, in fact, I'm just going to hand over to both of you, if that's okay with you both, and just let you introduce yourselves, if that's okay. And
thanks for having me, Derek and Leslie Ann, Noel, and everyone else who is here. And I'm really happy to have you on board to discuss this very important legacy of this Brazilian design educator. Now I hand you over quickly for Hien Fan's greetings. Would you like to say something before we start, Hien?
Oh, yeah. I think we sprout from Paulo Freire's readings a lot, and that is one of the articles that we co-wrote together for the LearnX Design Conference last year. So we would like to share more about that.
All right, folks. So yeah, I've been here 2020, long time ago, as Derek said, and I shared a few thoughts about design education in the Global South. Today, I'm sharing something interesting, bringing Global South method to the Global North. And that's exactly what I did with Hien. So we published a paper recently at Learning by Design conference in Portugal, I suppose. And this is part of a broader investigation of doing critical pedagogy or using the Paulo Freire method in many different nations and many places in Brazil, which is also almost like a continent itself, part of Latin America. And I would like to also invite you now for a cultural circle experience if you're interested and you can handle Portuguese, Spanish, or even Portuñol, which is a mix of both languages. Just come up and join us next week in this PDC Places online that I shared the link on the chat box so you can sign up. But today, we're not going to have exactly a cultural circle. That's why if you really want to engage in the cultural circle right away in practice, just come and join us. First of all, what is a culture circle? Before I get into that, I need to share what is a generative image, because this is, like say, the center of a culture circle. In the center of the culture circle, there's an image that generates further images. But these images can be let's say mental images or poetic images, metaphorical images. They don't need necessarily to be on visual communication. It can be also verbal images. So here's a generative image of Paulo Freire looking a generative image. Well, I'm making some kind of a visual pun here because I wanted to highlight the relevance and contemporaneous of Paulo Freire's teachings. Would you be surprised to learn that Paulo Freire was using those terms in the 60s? Well, why is that so? Well, the reason is that Paulo Freire was also looking at the beginnings or the dawn of artificial intelligence. And he was reading some works, not just by Noam Chomsky, as I'm featuring this slide here, and his generative grammar, which is we used actually to create large language models, or this kind of AIs that we popularly refer nowadays. But he was also reading Álvaro Vieira Pinto, a Brazilian philosopher who was writing about artificial intelligence. And he was in Chile. He was aware of the CyberSyn project, and he was influenced by this cybernetic Latin American tradition. So you can see some elements of this cybernetic thought and philosophy in his work. For example, here, a generative theme is represented by a word, but also by an image that shows the context of that word. And that is like a double loop, right? Because you see something in the reality, and then you see something else in reality that encompasses that initial reality. This is second order cybernetics in other terms, right? And this particular word is very important for and I'm going to present next. Tijolo in Portuguese means brick. And in the cultural circle formed around those generative themes, through dialogue, debate, the deeper structure of language that keeps illiterate people at the margins of society was unveiled. And that's why Paulo Freire's work is also known as pedagogy of the oppressed, because it's meant to be the oppressed understanding about the world, how it came to be oppressed in that way. And language is just one part of this big structure that divides society into two social groups. Let me give you a specific example. In this cultural circle hosted by Paulo Freire with the construction workers of Brasilia, the first, one of the first national capitals built from scratch using modernist designs. In this particular cultural circle, the brick revealed the material differences between the houses that construction workers were building, or the buildings on the right side, and the houses they had to build for themselves using bricks, not precast concrete. So it was a very clever choice. I'm showing you again the picture with this clear division of different construction designs, right? And the construction workers on the left side building their own houses and getting happy that at least they have this agency over their world, whereas the modern world is kept apart from them at distance, more like an image to be admired, but not touched or dwelled in. And what was important for these construction workers is that they could understand and use their construction knowledge into learning literacy and learning how to read and write. So in the same way that they would learn how to handle a brick, they would learn how to handle the brick word, tijolo, and its constructive parts. Tijolo is made out of syllables that they could mix in different ways and construct new words, pretty much self-build new words like they self-build their houses in those favelas in Brazil. So learning to read the world through Paulo Freire method means first critically reading the world before reading the word. It sounds a little bit like making a pun. In Portuguese, it's not like that, so I like to play those word games in English. In that way, learners would become more motivated to read and write words because they could envision how to transform their worlds with those words. For example, by reading and writing a bill of materials. Because many times, illiterate people, they are fooled by literate people when they have to sign on something where there's a quantity of materials they bought, but they cannot read which materials are being presented, right? So if they can read and write, they won't be fooled by some shady negotiations. Here's the visual diagram that synthesizes Paulo Freire's method in a few graphic relationships. At the core of it, generative themes that can generate debate, dialogues about the world, and then learners in dialogue, reading the world first, and then reading the word to amplify the reading of the world so that they can transform their world and continue the dialogue. That's why, yes, it looks like a cybernetic loop, and it is a cybernetic loop. That's why I claim that Paulo Freire was pretty much in touch with the artificial intelligence of his times. However, his work was not so appreciated at that time, right? Because it was dangerous to the existing power structures. Teaching how to read the word brick to illiterate people, construction workers of Brazil in those times, well, it was not just a technical choice, but really a historical political statement that ultimately led Paulo Freire to imprisonment and exile by the civil military dictatorship who took power in Brazil and also Brazil in 1964. At around that same time this happened, learning to read the modern world through the brick was becoming child's play in privileged country. Yes, make no mistake, those historical differences were constructed through colonialism and underdevelopment, and the situation in the global south was caused by this. So everything that we were suffering in terms of lack of democracy was basically furnishing and creating opportunities for privileged countries where democracy was thriving at that time. Even if privileged kids would not read words, they could still read bricks, because bricks was becoming almost like the foundation of a modern design language, and kids had to learn how to navigate a modern world. Therefore, they would be getting bricks as toys. Well, the brick became so powerful since then as a metaphor to read and write the modern world that an entire innovation and creativity method emerged all around it in the 90s, the Lego serious play method. And I have a particular relationship to that because my PhD supervisor, Professor Marcia van der Voort, was one of the first to experiment using Lego serious play in design education in 2016. After I defended successfully my PhD and returned home to Brazil to teach, I faced an interesting situation again, shifting worlds from global north to global south back again, and not the shortcomings of democracy. The first woman elected as Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff, suffered a white coup and paved the way to the rise of far-right Jair Bolsonaro in 2018. So if we apply the Paulo Freire method, Brazilian design education under such times required first reclaiming the brick to critically read this modern design world. And that's what we did. We started to tropicalize or cannibalize the Lego serious play method and use it, for example, with illiterate people that were designing a visual identity for their crafts business, solidarity craft businesses. Well, by 2023, Lego serious play was fully integrated into design culture circles hosted by the Laboratory of Design Against Oppression, LADO, at Federal University of Technology, Paraná, where I'm speaking from. And I got a position at the University of Florida to try this out in the United States. Would that work? That was 2023. And that's when I met Hien and we started to collaborate. And now I hand over to Hien. Would you like to continue the presentation,
Sure.
please?
Yeah, so in early 2024, that is when I met Fred. At the time, I was a second-year graduate student in the graduate program, Design and Visual Communications. We short for MXD because like I'm from Vietnam and my peers from all the countries from all over the world. That could be the Bahamas, Iran, Kenya, Ghana. Those countries have made the slogan of the program called MXD, which is short for Many by Design. So Fred at the time introduced the Lego serious play concept to us as one of the design research method. Each Lego serious play model represents the design research objects that we were interested at the time, but also in relations to each other, to the local communities, organizations. So when we put all of those together, the Lego serious play models together, we start to recognize the connections, not only condition at the time that we play the models in the graduate studio, but also the relations of our national origins on the global scales. So the Lego serious play becomes the generative, the interconnected generative themes that reflects what's going on in the studio. And the common threads of the Lego serious play models was when we were so excited to learn more about the design educations and how to bring back, to refer to our own knowledge of our cultural backgrounds. But there's always a sense of conflicts in navigating through the Florida's institutions, which at the time we didn't know that conflicts was stemmed from the colonial histories and the unresolved conflicts between the colonized and the colonizers. So by reading what's going on the local level, the communities related to the research objects, we start to start to understand the geopolitical impacts, the historical impacts onto our design research object. And that will lead me to a growing interest in unpacking, or I guess like reading, why does that conflicts happen between international students, students from different cultural backgrounds in the institution that encourages inclusions, diversity, multicultural backgrounds in the learning knowledge. So in a way, this brought me to my beginning stage of the MFA thesis project at the time. When we started the Lego Serious Play, it was just very early in February, but then Fred and I began using Lego Serious Play in our advisory meetings. So the Lego Serious Play design experiments span from February to November of 2024. Fred encouraged me to read the research objects through many times. And you can see how the forms of Lego models changed from very vague to much more constructed forms that resemble the world around me, the institutions around me, and the cultural identities or cultural backgrounds that shape my peers and I today. That is when I grasped the generative theme of all, which is the contradictions of institutional diversity. The generative theme is also seen when we did the autoethnographic study in Gainesville, Florida, where we read the visual vocabulary of the universe based on the streets. So on the left, that is the words of the marginalized body, the local marginalized body in Gainesville, Florida. And they wrote their words in the abandoned infrastructure in downtown. While on the right, which is also another building that is very close to that abandoned infrastructure, which is where institutions represented cultural differences in a very vibrant, clean design. So that is where I read in depth the contradictions of institutional diversity as a generative theme that happens in the urban space even before I know about it as a immigrant student, which will lead me to the next slide. All the contradictions that have happened before we even know is already contextualized by the political climates in Florida at the time. So in 2022, the far-right Governor DeSantis have passed several bills in Florida. On one hand, he emphasized the market values of diversity. On another hand, he passed the bills against specific diversity communities such as LGBTQIA+ communities, immigrants of so-called 7 countries of concerns, critical theories, while also banning the DEI programs, which is short for diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as related topics to racism from higher education. So this led me to the kind of comparison between what's going on in the news as well as the lived experiences that I had within the university. I entered, I was very welcomed by all the faculty and staff in the university. So indeed, the university tried to include us as diverse students, celebrating us, kind of detaching from what's going on in the political climates, while also complying with the new rules, such as the DEI programs in the university was closed. Anything related to race, gender, identity was definitely closed, and reframed it to the new word, which is student engagement. Very broad, but also try to shy away from what's going on in the political attacks. In this picture, I think the presentation was out, Fred.
Let me try to bring it on back. Just a minute.
Thank you.
Should be back.
Yes, I think that's great. And in the picture on the left, you can see here is like many international students in that welcoming event hosted by the university. Was trying to pin onto the global map of where we're coming from. And the international students' national origins actually accumulated, well, mainly from Europe and very little from countries in Africa, Russia, little to none, North Korea, so on and so forth. Those countries have different political viewpoints from the United States. So in fact, international students or diversity was shaped in the narrative of the institutions with or without we paying attention to that. In response to the university's welcoming events, but also selection of diversity, I hosted a culture circle around two generative themes. So one is student migration, which is based on our lived experiences as a graduate program, and global politics, which is less familiar topic to us, but depicted by local newspaper. And that actually condition our migration, even whether we know about it or not. So this will lead to the next slide, which is where when we read all the global south countries that are mentioned in the local newspaper, we recognize that the common words that refer to global south countries were actually exotic food, cheap labor, whether that is in like retail or sports, entertainment, and global north countries are referred to as education, well-known spot, or technical advancements such as technological high-tech advancements. And through reading the contrast representation of global south and global north in the local newspaper, we try to understand how our own travel experiences, how our migration as global south countries plays into this canvas. So it's altogether makes sense, like the difficulty of people traveling from countries in Africa or in Iran was made was like contextualized in the bigger geopolitics representation. And through reading what's going on, how we are represented by others, by the local newspaper, we try to speculate how we can cope with, or how can we critique, challenge, and make a space of ourselves is mainly global south students and some of the global north students together. One of the common thing is a shared space, celebrating identity while also being critical of each other's cultural histories that ties to colonialism. And that will bring us to another, the next slide, which is at the time why I was like progressing towards my MFA thesis project. I was also a graduate teaching assistant to undergrad students, graphic design students, and the students definitely know well about the local space of Florida, United States, much more than me because I'm immigrant, and I try to update with the politics and the social context, but there's definitely something in the students' lived experiences that I don't know much. So the question come up when applying Paulo Freire method is, can typography design students design the worlds, bring what's going on in their life into their academic performance, and design the word for themselves? One of the common things that students has experienced while designing Lego serious play in picturing their own world is the struggles. The struggles, whether they are the BIPOC, marginalized students, people of color, in experiencing experiencing less than in comparison to students from the
Yeah,
so
it comes again. I will try to recover it. Keep talking.
Yes. So I can explain it further. So what's going on in that frame is students try to bring up the topic that they experience as less than others. In some words, they would mention how surveillance, institutions, lack of resources for them has been a common thing. And one of the in front of you is one of the students' work, which she referred to PCOS, which is a health condition that some women experience. While this is not an uncommon health condition, the lack of institutions resource for people with the syndrome and people without the syndrome to support each other is problematic. So she designed a series of postcards that celebrates being a woman, but also being critical of the lack of institutions resources. And we have a lot of conversations during this process. Some students were like, well, I didn't know about this. Well, some students remain, I would say that they were unfamiliar with this kind of culture circles in graphic design courses, so they were reluctant at first. But through the conversations with each other, the involvement in the projects comes from the collectiveness, the dialogues among themselves. And I'm mainly the facilitator. The Paulo Freire method works also very well with other generative tools in co-design. We can see that in Sanders and Stabler's the book on convivial toolbox, and now I transition into a professor position in Boise, Idaho. I moved from Florida to Idaho, which is the new cultural context, and I also engage Lego Serious Play along with other toolkits that Fred have introduced to the MXD program. On the top parts, those are the activities that I helped organizing, where Lego Serious Play toolkits, generative toolkits were used for my peers to read their challenges in navigating the institution, read themselves within the political climates, and recognize racism as being normalized in media and institution. While at the bottom, those are the generative toolkits being used mainly. So students went out to field trips, observing the colonial archives that now become a tourist spot. And students, actually, a lot of local students don't go to those tourist areas, which is quite interesting because the tourist areas are the historical representation of the colonial space, but they don't often go there. And those toolkits were used as a way for them to find another lens, in critical lens, in reading the colonial histories, in designing in response or in critique of that, in reflection of their own privilege, or when in another program we project we design package and we try to understand how sustainability has been engraved into graphic designs as a greenwashing direction. So this led me into a recognition in the next slide, is that if students design the words with no critical consciousness of designing the world around them, they would just reinforce alienation, inequality, and oppression. And that is important when we came into the collective consciousness through generative tools and themes together. So the last slide of all, which is the invitation for all of us to like read and reread and transform Paulo Freire Method in the heating moments. Paulo Freire Method is not just a literacy method, but it's also a design method for learning how to read and write with worlds, and not just about the worlds ourselves individually. So yeah, this is the reference list for anyone interested. And we also copy and paste it in the chat, and this is our contacts.
Awesome, brilliant. Thank you so much, Ken and Fred. And I've put a link to the your last paper as well into the chat as well. If anybody does have any questions, could you please put them in the Q&A section or stick them in the chat? That'd be absolutely great. We've had to mute participants for this session just because we've got so many participants. You're more than happy to voice your question if you want to put your hand up as well. So yeah, thank you very much, Ken and Fred. We have one question in the Q&A. It'd be interesting actually to hear what you think of this one. So it's asking about, this is from Ermila. I hope I'm pronouncing your name okay there, Ermila. I'd like to ask, how can universal design for disability participation be included in this model? I think you've kind of hinted at bits of it already, but yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there's a particular response that you might want to go for it, Fred.
Well, we haven't tried that yet, but I suppose it's possible. We just need to make sure that we define universal design in proper terms. Otherwise, if, for example, if you mean by universal design, design for everyone, the same, one size fits all, or even one size can adapt to all, well, that might be problematic because it might concentrate too much power over designers and maybe be based on, so let's say, a paternalistic approach where you know what the other needs, right? And whereas for let's say a critical view of universal design will be more like, all right, let's design from our specific conditions towards another specific condition that is similar to ours. Instead of designing for the other, we design for ourselves. That could be also universal, I would say, because sometimes we might find people that are like us and facing similar situation in other parts of the world. And that's not, I would say, let's say, the same as an imperialistic discourse that top down from one world to others. But this, we can still have what I call alternative universes from one world to another, and that will not be oppressive.
Okay, I'm gonna maybe invite Ermila to just maybe speak back to that or talk back to that. Ermila, do you want to?
Yes, to me there is a definition of universal design which somehow was developed by somebody that studied architecture and that was a wheelchair user. So and that doesn't mean oppressive designing from the power structures. It means rather trying to think about as much diverse approaches as is possible. I'm sorry.
That's okay, no problem. No, thank you very much, Armila. I don't know if Ken or Fred, do you want to come back in?
I just want to say that I don't like to oppose universal design to pluriversal design, like some of our folks like Leslie-Ann, right? I think it's possible to have universal design within pluriversal design, provided that we get this, let's say, second definition that Armila and I are bringing up on the table.
I did mute my phone. I just needed to unlock it. We can. You.
Oh, sorry, Amila, I think you're breaking up there a wee bit. I think we'll maybe leave it at that one, and we'll maybe move on to, we've got a couple of other questions. We can come back to that if you want to put a bit more detail in the chat. I mean, for me, personally speaking, I think one of the important themes, I guess, round about this is process versus object. I mean, for me, everything you've presented so far, Ken and Fred, is very much process. You have to be there to feel it, to experience it, to do it. It's a generative thing, as opposed to some of the conceptions of universal stuff that we've seen emerging, particularly in design, which fixes things and just says, no, that's the way you do it. Maybe that's the agreeable disagreement, if that makes sense there. So we've got a couple more in the chat. There's one that might just be a straightforward yes or no. I hope this isn't somebody wanting to introduce some other topics. It's, are you tracking participatory AI in your work? And if you wanted to generalize that question, Fred or Ken, to not to AI more generally, but to emerging models, then that's absolutely fine too.
Well, I would say no, we're not working with participatory AI.
Perfect.
That's it. This is another way of understanding artificial intelligence, because I mentioned Álvaro Vieira Pinto's work, right? And he wrote about artificial intelligence as being the only human intelligence possible. Any human intelligence is socially constructed, therefore it is artificial intelligence. And from that perspective, machines, computers, they enter that intelligence and they are just mediating aspects and definitely not a participant, right? So it wouldn't make sense to call it participatory artificial intelligence in such circumstance. But maybe that's a topic for another conversation, right? How to integrate, how to criticize artificial intelligence as part of critical pedagogy or the Paulo Freire method.
Cool. I mean, has anybody tried introducing a dialogue model into the dialogue here? No? Okay, let's not go there. Yeah, that would be an interesting one for a future discussion. I'll come to you in just a second, Michael. We've got one more in the Q&A text before I come to you. One is, I'd be quite interested to expand this question as well, because we do tend to look at this. I'm not going to say we tend to see it as a positive process, but I'm guessing for some students it might actually be quite challenging. And I guess as educators, it might also be very challenging going into a context and trying to engage very different educational modes. So the question here is, do you see any limitations applying this method in neoliberal global minority universities? Global minority, okay. And how does such an approach?
I handle it for you. Because I'm always asking that question to him. Would you, if you ever in the future will return Vietnam, would you be able to apply this method to Vietnam?
I would say so, yes. Just because one of the pros part of Vietnam, and then I see in my peers from the shared global South countries' origins, is that we embrace participation and like impromptu, a lot of changes even in our daily lives. And that is something missing, or I guess like devalue for the lack of, I don't know, profits, time efficiency. And when I like study and also teach in United States here, and in general, we don't like a lot of changes because of how institutionalization has become a safe space or a safety net already. So like when it comes to participation, there will be like some, I don't know, hesitance, rolling eyes. And that's a normal thing when we started critical pedagogy or Paulo Freire methods. But usually through times, like students get to know each other more and they build trust in each other more, especially like younger students population when they are frequented with high tech. What in Vietnam, there's a lot of changes that would be definitely a cultural shock to someone like Global South person returning from the Global North to me. But that is like that is also a part of the I guess like the colonized cultures, our way of developing and our ways of like I don't know, like embracing new knowledge, regardless of who like the histories, and always a desire to catch up, but do things differently from the failures of parts of the global north that we observe. So yes, the answer for that is definitely yes.
Cool, awesome. Thank you, Ken. Michael, do you want to jump in and then we'll bounce back to some of the questions are starting to come thick and fast now.
So,
Michael, go for it.
I have more. Thanks, Derek. Thank you both for your wonderful presentation. I'm really moved and touched somehow, yeah, that so many people have come to listen to your presentation. That makes me really hopeful that this theme around Freire and second-order cybernetics, of course, suddenly gets some recognition. I really am moved by that. Thanks for that. What I actually wanted to, so you should maybe try to attend this second-order cybernetics conference this year in Ouro Preto in Brazil. They will also talk about design and cybernetics and perhaps Freire. What I wanted to say now is how when I used to be a researcher before I became a teacher. And so when I got into teaching, I started from scratch and started reading Neil Postman and of course, Paulo Freire. And what I discovered there, so I'm a professor for design theory in former East Germany. And I discovered that my students also had this kind of showed the same symptoms as Freire's adult learners, in that they somehow, when they stepped through the door, they left their East German problems and personality sort of behind, as it is in higher education. Yeah, you come through the door and you're in the university, but here it was really symptomatic, and it concerns the language and it has to do with, in England we would say, in a class, in a sense. Yeah, it's a different mindset. And so I discovered that they're kind of a second generation traumatized. Yeah, from their background, from living in an authoritarian regime. Yeah. That was my experience. And I started to write papers about that, connecting it to second order cybernetics and also to the learning cycle that you've developed. And in second order cybernetics, take a look at Argyris and Schön and Kolb. There it's a double loop learning cycle. Yeah, so it's not just a single loop, it's double loop learning. And this is, in the sense cybernetics, that it's that you're all the time correcting the course. You can still check if your goals are still in order with your current inquiry.
Cool. Okay. Sorry, Fred, on you go. Do you want to come in on that? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly that when we are making sense of things that comes from the global south, from the global north perspective, sometimes we try to draw bridges that are too quickly built, and then we do not maybe pay attention to the huge not just cultural, but worldly differences. And in our presentation, we were talking about the shifting from one world to another world, and the democratic backlashes that we were also facing, that was shifting and changing the same world. Because once we got a coup and it works, the whole structure of the nation changes all of a sudden. The oppressors are new oppressors. And then we have to also attend to our students' life and the way they experience the trauma. As Michelle was saying, indeed, politics and, let's say, the whole material conditions of our students' existence can become a generative theme for discussing in classrooms. But this was discovered by Paulo Freire, was not something that people in the global north were doing. If you look at, for example, at what education theory was describing back in the 60s, they were probably far away from cybernetics. So he was probably one of the first to apply that. And then if you would describe another thing that happened later on, let's say design thinking. Wow, it looks like design thinking. Yeah, but design thinking came much later. I'm sorry. and nowadays, in this pluriversal dialogues we are having now, we have an opportunity to repair for those inequalities and epistemic violence. For example, to say, yeah, what Paulo Freire did, we already have done it. We know, but bear in mind the history and the culture where they came from, and the inequalities that we are discussing when we are doing such, that we are trying to repair when we are doing such dialogues.
Cool, thank you very much. So,
and truly participatory.
Exactly, that's also why the Scandinavians got inspired and created this participatory design approach. Unfortunately, many people forget about it, and now they look at Freire and say, yeah, we were doing this in participatory design since the 70s, but they forget about Paulo Freire's contribution back those days.
Cool, awesome. I'm going to put two questions together because one might be a quick question, and it is a kind of interesting one, because basically the question is, does the process have to include Lego serious play? I'll let you read into that whatever you want. Treat it at the surface or as a political thing, no problem at all. The other one is actually a bit more interesting. Well, not a bit more interesting, sorry, I don't mean that in that sense. I mean, it's a bit more in depth in terms of asking, have you found that including these kind of research and methods can help to transform universities' colonial perspectives? So that's more than the student, that's into the, you know, the spaces within which the students are learning and teaching. So yeah, I don't know if you want to have a go at those two questions back to back.
Now I want to know what Leslie Ann Noel has to say, because she's really into this challenge right now. Because, for example, if I'm let's say a assistant professor trying to do something, and then Hien is trying to do as a teaching professor. But what about if you are a dean of a design school like Leslie Ann? And she's also into Paulo Freire Method. So I'm really curious. This is on you, Leslie.
Yeah, how's it going, Leslie?
Well, I was looking at the Q&A and I'm also like a back person in this meeting, so I may not have heard the whole question. Which was the question? The question was about universal versus pluriversal.
How do you transform the colonial legacies of universities using this method?
Oh, so one thing though is, you know, for me, what is really important about Freire's methods is just creating the space for us to see the world. And, you know, you both talked about this, and this is what I saw also in my PhD. My PhD was Freirean, and I felt that, you know, I feel that in design we do design and we make design solutions without trying to see the world and talk about the world, and we just go straight to solutions. And so, like on my level then as dean, we really do spend, or I spend a lot of time trying to see the world and getting people to talk about, you know, the real issues and the problems. But of course, you know, I'm a utopian designer. And so as part of the solutioning, I do ask people to describe their utopias. And then as an administrator, it gives me a path that we're working towards as people are designing the utopias. It starts to, you know, kind of spell out what might be the kind of policies that we might need or the infrastructure that we might need to get people to the utopias. But I really think that thing of creating space for people to really examine the world a little bit more critically is very important. So like, as I looked at your work, I really, of course, loved seeing people work with the newspapers, which is, again, very Freirean. in my work, I did that with children, where we sat down and we looked at the newspapers every day, talked about all of the issues in the world, and then started to dream of new worlds. And so I'm kind of rambly, I'm just excited about this work. And the way I operationalize it is to get people to describe utopias after examining what's keeping us back. And then, we build our solutions around that, both the barriers and the utopias.
Oh, so Fred or Jan, do you want to add to that one? Or could I slip in a cheeky sub-question around how does the power shift, or does the power shift? So if you're doing this with students, for example, and you don't have a Leslie Ann Noel Dean to operate the levers of power, if you see what I mean, do you see shifts, with the students that you're working in? Do they influence the institutions, and how do those kind of influences come about?
How about you, Ian, to start with this one?
Leslie raised hand.
I can speak after you. It's a question that I want to bring back in.
Okay.
So I'll just put it out there. Yes.
Yes. I think this question, I've been thinking about it, but there's definitely also like why students learn to read and design the word. I'm also doing that part along with them, especially like one of the new, like I just entered this role for like a couple of years. So it's not a whole lot of, I would say that there's something very good in like quote unquote about the colonial institution is that the legacy has been very well built throughout the span of histories and is engraved into the habits, the way that we students view the world. And even I, when enter United States universities to study, that has been, it was something normalized as a powerful, decent place, and otherwise other spots. So like the process, and that also comes with the authority to assign students to learn something. With Paulo Freire's method and critical pedagogy, that is the long process of engage democratically with students and also have students unlearn whatever biases and oppressive habits that they have. And that's definitely take time, especially in the place that they call home, quote unquote. And they have like the history so far has generally proved that at least in the United States, the role of oppressive and colonial legacy is always there. So engage democratically and have students learn it. Like also, so learn the colonial tactics in order to find ways to respond, and to critique them by respecting students. And that's I'm still in the process for sure.
Cool.
Take it away.
Thank you very much, Ian. I mean, Ian and Fred, can you both see the Q&A section as well? Are there any questions there that you might want to really pull out? And do you have a quick answer to the do you have to use Lego Serious Play question? You don't have to.
I have something I wanted to bring
up. Sorry, Leslie Ann, of course.
Yeah,
my apologies.
Yeah.
Leslie.
No.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's related to John's question about the global minority, global majority question, right? So global minority, he put a clarifier is in fact the global north. And that's the tension that, I sometimes have, Fred, I'm sure that you have, we are using these methods in the global north and the global south. Now, actually, I can't find it. All right. So the question was about the limitations in applying this method in neoliberal global minority universities, meaning like you know, you're using a method that was designed in Brazil or in the global south, and you're using it in a place like Florida. And he was asking about the limitations in taking the method in to this other context. So I just wondered, I wanted to bring that back because I think we might have gone in a different direction in the response.
That's right. And I see Frank's comments on the chat box also bringing up the issue of how do you apply Paulo Freire method if students are not interested, or they are not having critical consciousness? Well, first of all, the limitation of Paulo Freire method is not the method itself. It's all about the limitation of the society and the power structures that are in place, the history, the culture, politics, and particularly democratic regimes or lack of democratic regimes. But this is all interesting design material. If you begin by saying, well, it's impossible to do anything with this, okay, fine, do something else. Just don't come and tell this is a limitation of the Paulo Freire method. I'm sorry, because if you really apply a method, first you need to understand what does oppression means. And once you understand it, you see that the limitations are not in the method itself. It's part of the world, right? The world has limitations, and then you problematize those limitations. And that's the basic beginning of the method, right? So if you don't understand that those problems are the problems you need to handle, right? Oh, if students are not critical enough, yeah, good. Then you apply the method, right? You don't start with the method if people are already critically literate, right? It doesn't make sense. If people already know how to read and write and voting, and they participate in elections whatsoever, of course, there's always possibility of problematizing further things. But we should never begin the method with a fatalistic approach. Let's say it's impossible to do anything, right? Hope is also another very important basic principle of the method.
I wonder if that also touches on the point that's being made about the institutional context. Once again, it's the context within which you do this or can do this. Leslie Ann's already mentioned that one of the major steps is to allow that space to start to see the world. I'm wondering if there is something there in terms of doing this within institutions very often that themselves are, part of the structures of oppression in themselves. I think both of you have framed very clearly and articulately that the power that comes from this is the personal transformation within the students. That's where this thing really, really comes to life. Is there a point at which you accept that, yes, you might be working within a structure that is necessarily oppressive, but I'm not going to say maybe that doesn't matter to dismiss it, but maybe that's less important if you are still empowering students to be agents in the world beyond that, if that makes sense? Does that sit comfortably? Does that make any sense at all? Or is that still a problematic in itself?
Yeah, well, it's liberation starts from somewhere and it continues somewhere else. So we never start from scratch. Paulo Freire said there's no absolute ignorance as much as there's no absolute knowledge, right? And that's also interesting for AI, right? Because AI currently is claiming to have absolute knowledge, but there's not such a thing. There's always ignorance as part of that knowledge, and that's fine. That's how we actually build up a locally grounded but forward-looking, let's say universally looking pedagogy, and connecting different places and people that are trying to do these things even under such oppressive conjunctures. And then we find hope because we are part of a collective. But it has to start somewhere in terms of our experience, and we have to maybe wait until we find those other collectives to share and build upon something larger than our localities.
Cool, awesome. I'm very conscious of the fact that we are at time for this, so if people do have to leave, that's absolutely fine. I'm maybe just going to push the last question. This is the final one because it has been raised a couple of times. There's a second question now here about Lego Serious Play. So we have to address the Lego problem in the room. So one is, do you have to use Lego Serious Play? And the second one is, do you need to be a Lego Serious Play certified, I don't know, practitioner, user?
I think it would be counterproductive because we are hacking, subverting legacy display. We are definitely not certified facilitators. We are, and I would say we are more like complicators than facilitators, right? Because we complicate, we bring up contradiction and things that are hard to talk about, like oppression. And we definitely can do that with other materials and generative tools, as Hien shared in the very last slides. And you can find inspiration on the work of Elizabeth Sanders, Peter Jan Stappers, and their book. But also, any design thinking method can be converted to, let's say, a liberative purpose. And Black feminists in the United States have done a lot of this. For example, the Racist Untaught Toolkit by Lisa Mercer and Teresa Moses is a great example. And Hien showed one of the slides, but there's more to it. And let's keep in touch in this conversation to sharing other ways of applying the method.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Fred. That's a really powerful message to kind of end on as well, that some of the existing methods can be brought into this to almost destruct them in some ways. That's really, really quite powerful. Hien, did you want to add any last thoughts or words?
For the question?
Anything at all. Anything at all. You don't have to answer the Lego thing.
Well, yeah, I think that's a lot. Like the conversation from, I guess, like from how we applied it and from those who are looking forward to application of Paulo Freire's method or not has like showed how like there's a lot of works to still do and apply Paulo Freire's method and to reread his legacy of works, because like that's a global South revolutions that condition the transitions, or at least like the migration of global South people to the global North people to subvert the power from the colonial institutions. So yeah, I think that also proves that there's a lot of hopes and there's a lot of challenges in the way that we do things.
Definitely. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And thanks for bringing it to life as well. I've been waiting to hear what you've all been up to for a wee while now. And there genuinely seems to be something really quite powerful and agent-inducing, shall we say, in what you're doing. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And yeah, thank you for your time. And once again, if everybody could just show their appreciation, that would be greatly appreciated, even if it is virtual appreciation. There you go. Thank you very much, Fred and Hien. And thank you, everybody, for coming along. And as I say, the recording will be made available as soon as we possibly can after this session. And if anybody does want to stay for the non-recorded part, that's absolutely fine. Nobody has to stay. And by the way, Hien and Fred, you don't have to stay to keep talking if you don't want to. That's no problem at all. And thank you all so much. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.